Okay, so thank you and welcome to this Postgraduate Research Student Conference 2021 at the School of Modern Languages. This is the first event of this kind that we've had in a very long time, and it is with great pleasure that I'm here presenting the first panel today. We have a sensational program for the day with three panels of PhD presenters on the themes of memory, translation, and politics. And each panel will be followed by a Q&A session, so please use the Q&A feature to ask questions to our panelists. And for anyone who has not seen the complete program yet, I will just share the link for the program on the chat, so have a look if you haven't seen it before. Okay, so the panels will be held in this webinar link at the appointed times in the program. And for the coffee and lunch breaks, we will share a regular Zoom call link in the chat, which will enable us to share a cup of tea and see each other and meet some of you who are attending this session. And when the time comes to switch links, we will remind you, so don't worry. And if you have any questions, please, any questions that are not for the panelists, please use the chat, and Rachel, who is keeping an eye on the comments, will answer your queries, okay? So anyway, without further delay, I am here to present the first panel of memory with three speakers in their first year of the PhD, Iona Ramsey, Jack Lewis, and Lauren Constance. And I would like now to introduce our first speaker, Iona, because she will be having her presentation recorded. I will pause the recording now, okay? Okay, so our next speaker of the day is Jack Lewis. Jack is a first-year PhD student, and he will be introducing his research and a chapter-by-chapter plan of the project going forward. Jack graduated from Exeter University with a BA in English and Visual Culture in 2018, and Goldsmiths, University of London, with an MA in Contemporary Art Theory in 2020. His thesis, focuses on the historical and philosophical relationship between nostalgia and ideology, and he is supervised by Heiko Feldner and Professor Fabio Viggi here in the School of Modern Languages. All yours, Jack.
Thank you. Just sharing the screen. Can everyone see it okay? Oh, good. Just a minute. The screen is in the way. Oh. I didn't. Can you see that okay? It's just, how do I get that? Oh, well. You can see it okay. I can speak from here if that's all right, because there's a tab on the top that's completely spoiling the view. All right. So a bruising ideology, post-humanity and the nostalgic drive. In February this year, the online genealogy platform MyHeritage launched a new feature which used deep learning technology to animate the faces of past loved ones in historical photographs. Through a process of enhancing the resolution of often blurry and antiquated still images and using a driver to provide the sequences for the animation, one could experience the faces of their relatives or old friends blink, smile, and move their heads. The feature was called Deep Nostalgia, with MyHeritage claiming that it was intended for nostalgic use, that is, to bring beloved ancestors back to life. The platform encouraged users to try the deep learning technology on their own historical photos, uploading and sharing the reanimated faces of their friends and family on social media in a diffuse, multiple, and interconnected nostalgic spectacle. The public response was mixed, with some in awe of the magical properties of the technology, while others found it creepy in the way it could only partially animate the faces of the dead, the most comforting and familiar sign of life, the turning of a face, instead evoking a horror excess, blending nostalgic sensation with a shuddering unease. In its collapsing of oppositional categories, the familiar and the unnerving, private and public consumptive space, the magic of technological acceleration, and the creep of undead humanity in its wake. Deep nostalgia implicates an incessant affective and ontological problem for post-human subjectivity. This problem lies in the gap between the emotional impulses within the subject and the formational processes of subjectivization that shape our meaningful attachment to reality, in effect making human life as possible. The poet Susan Stewart calls this gap nostalgia, quote, the absence that is the very generating mechanism of desire. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek calls it ideology, quote, a generative matrix that regulates the relationship between visible and non-visible, between imaginable and non-imaginable. Deep nostalgia is exemplary of the persistence of nostalgic fantasies in human desire and our compulsion to nurture and satisfy these dreams in order for reunion with the lost objects of our past. It is this that makes nostalgia an indispensable element in the study of ideology, since the nostalgic's bittersweet desire to return to a premediated experience of free, spontaneous, lived reality can only maintain its sway on the subject precisely under the contrived and meticulous processes of ideological mediation. The technology behind deep nostalgia effectively captures this tension, which is at the same time the ideological operation of the nostalgic fantasy, as it arouses desire simultaneously as a failure of presence, as the incommensurability between our nostalgic need and the lost object, and as a failure of absence at the same time, or the blinking eyes of our dead relative. The feature does not undercut a more honest nostalgic experience, but on the contrary confronts us with the perplexing eeriness at the heart of our most intimate nostalgic desires, immanent sensations of longing brought to life, as it were, by the discorporate backdrop of ideology. So in brief then, my research examines the historical, clinical, and philosophical development of ideology and nostalgia as twin agencies of modern subjectivity, seeking to mutually resuscitate both notions for their speculative power in addressing such urgent political and philosophical questions as post-capitalist modernity and desire and post-human affect and consciousness. Nostalgia is popularly understood as longing for the lost object, a homesickness of the heart. Ideology as false consciousness, a homesickness of the mind. A bruising ideology places the bodily stain of trauma at its heart in its attempt to develop a new theory of subjectivity from this affective and cognitive dynamic of homesickness by reinterpreting Slavoj Žižek's Lacanian conception of ideology through poetics and contemporary research on nostalgic feeling, speculating on the shifting ontological status of nostalgic humanism. Drawing inspiration from, but also crucially moving beyond conventional critiques of nostalgic affect as a consumer strategy of new media technologies or as a symptom of degenerated political consciousness, my project advances a new understanding of the role of nostalgic drive in ideology. So I've divided the project into 3 chapters. The first chapter is a philosophy of modernity that takes the mutual development of nostalgic sensation and ideology critique at its core. It is a genealogical account of how these two notions interacted, from their origins in the medical sciences, to political heresies of Enlightenment modernity, to inescapable bittersweet elements of the human experience that one must swallow rather than overcome. So it was only 300 years before my heritage that British sailors would jump into the ocean, imagining the surface to be a pastoral landscape. So captivated as they were by this nostalgia that was considered back then this curable and overwhelming disease that consumed its hosts, whereas today it's just a lifestyle sort of pastime. So what were the conditions of possibility for these two phenomena? Nostalgia from curable disease of displacement to inconsolable feature of the human condition, ideology from critical enlightenment tool for humanity's demystification to the brand name of cognitive enslavement to systems of ideas. And in the second chapter, it's a theory of homesick subjectivity that marries Slavoj Žižek's influential theory of ideology as a fantasy that structures rather than obscures social reality, with art historian Carol Mayville's metaphor of the bruise and nostalgic longing. This chapter explores the constitutive role of nostalgia in psychoanalytic understanding of human life and subjectivity, from Freud to Lacan and Žižek, And a particular emphasis will be on Zizek's philosophical machine of the lineage from Marx, Hegel, and Lacan, but that's it's meant to be a brief introduction, so I won't go into that. And then the third chapter finally is a speculative analysis of the philosophical relationship between nostalgia and nihilism. Start with a comparative reading of both left and right-wing critiques and solutions for 20th century alienated modernity, from Simone Weil and Walter Benjamin to Martin Heidegger and the reactionary modernists. I put the bruising ideology thesis to the challenge of contemporary political philosophies of capitalism, particularly accelerationism, as theorized by Mark Fisher and Nick Land, while the historian Svetlana Boym considers nostalgia to be more or less homologous with modernity, a sort of invention of modernity. And Nick Land sees modernity as an alien invasion from the future, mankind merely the temporary hosts rather than transhistorical managers of this process of technoscience and capitalist economics. If there is to be a productive encounter between these two orientations, the preoccupations with the tragic and the nihilistic, it starts with a renewed theory of the subject, with the notion of death drive as an intractable longing for wholeness. Nostalgia as, to paraphrase Milan Kundera, a form of death ever present within life. To kind of summarize the whole point of the project in all, I see the connection between ideology and nostalgia as a suturing of the irreducible trauma that sustains human life. And I hope to come back with an even more pessimistic attitude in the third year, when I come back with more concrete findings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jack. That was superb. Any questions for Jack, please use the Q&A. Thank you again. It's definitely a little bit on the on the sad side, isn't it? So hang in there with your research, please. Okay, so our final speaker for the memory panel is Lauren Constance. Lauren will be presenting her reflections on her first year of doing a PhD. She graduated from Cardiff University, in 2019 with a BA in Spanish and Japanese, and she then took a gap year to travel Europe and Japan. In 2020, Lauren returned to Cardiff University to start a PhD, which looks at the use of witness testimony in Japanese memorial museums. Her supervisors are Dr. Christopher Hood and Dr. Russell Mead in Cardiff School of Modern Languages. All yours, Lauren.
Hello. Sharing things and slides. I'm hoping that's working. I hope. Yeah. Okay. Hello, and thank you to the organisers for this opportunity to present and also to get to know everyone else in the school. So as we're sort of approaching the end of the academic year, I thought I'd make use of this sort of free format and use this presentation as an opportunity to reflect on what I've learned over the first year of my PhD, and then talk a little bit about how this has shaped the direction that my thesis is sort of going in. I've chosen an image of the atomic bomb dome in Hiroshima to represent my research today. The dome is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's a haunting reminder to many of the horrors of nuclear war, but it's also a symbol of peace. And over 70 years after the bombing, the dome still stands today as a testament to what happened in Hiroshima. However, people do not have this same longevity as memorials, and eyewitnesses to the Hiroshima atomic bombing now have an average age of 83. Therefore, there's a sense of urgency that we now need to work to preserve and communicate their unique testimonies to future generations who might not have the experience of war or nuclear disaster. So this is why I'm researching the use of digital technology to exhibit eyewitness accounts in Japanese memorial museums. This research developed from my undergraduate dissertation, which looked at how eyewitness testimony videos are used in the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. And this research showed that contrary to what we may often find in perhaps Holocaust memorial museums, video testimony does not feature heavily in the exhibits. Instead, the Hiroshima Museum chooses to foreground artifacts. So my PhD will expand on this research by looking at different museums across Japan, which memorialise a range of both disasters, and I'm also looking to include more positive aspects of Japanese heritage over the last 100 or so years. So what have I learned? Firstly, I learned that the jump between undergraduate studies and then going straight into a PhD is quite a big leap. The first iterations of my literature review worked around the question, how do memorial museums display eyewitness testimony in Japan? And this meant that my writing became a little bit descriptive of the different approaches that museums may take to display eyewitness testimony. However, since meeting with my supervisors in my 9-month review, we have worked to make the study more analytical through a focus on ethics. So upon analysis of the literature, it appears as though the issue of ethical representations of eyewitnesses is something that is discussed in Holocaust literature, but it's not something that I have come across yet in my readings on Japan. And there are so many ethical questions on this topic. So looking at the ethics of both oral history and mediatized representation is an area that I'm looking to research more to get the analysis across that I was originally lacking. Secondly, I learnt the importance of challenging assumptions and not taking things at face value. So early in my research, I focused on an argument that we have a global memory culture. And many authors referred to a global approach to remembrance, stemming from the Holocaust trials, which went on to inform memorialization practices on a global scale. At first glance, this seemed pretty logical. However, from, again, discussion with my supervisors and reading, perhaps global memory culture is not as global as it appears. Because to what extent can we really say that it is the Holocaust that informs memorialization practices in Japan? And to give an example, the Holocaust is not really widely covered in the Japanese school curriculum. Additionally, studies on global tourism issues focus on the wealthy, middle-class European, North American demographic when discussing global tourism problems. But in Japan, we find that the majority of inbound tourists are from East Asia, over 70% in 2019. So this highlighted the fact that some theories and literature that are purported to be representative of global phenomena are actually perhaps only based on European or North American case studies, and they only consult English language scholarship. So this is an area where I feel like my research has the potential to contribute to the existent literature, using the Japanese case study and Japanese sources to critique and problematize Western approaches. Finally, I learnt the importance of keeping connected, whether that be through the fortnightly PGR forums, the supervisor meetings, or coffee chats with other PGRs. The global pandemic has brought the issue of digitalization to the forefront, and as we know, many in-person events have turned digital. But starting a PhD in this time gave me the opportunity to participate in different Zoom calls and seminars that I probably wouldn't have had the opportunity to otherwise. And one of those was listening to the testimony of 93-year-old Miyake Nobuo, who was an eyewitness to the Hiroshima bombing. I found it amazing that he seemed so confident and so capable of telling his story on a digital platform, but he was very well supported by organisations to do this. However, some parts of the testimony were inaudible and there were a lot of technical issues. Although this, for me, didn't detract from the moving and fascinating testimony, it does show that there is room for research into making the digital experience of listening to eyewitnesses coming somewhat close to hearing the stories in person. So, looking to the coming year, I've got a lot of things on my to-do list. So I'm currently making fact files for different events and museums across Japanese history, and then using these to plan my field work. As you can see on the map, there's quite a lot of museums, so I need to narrow those down. And so in that field work to Japan, which I've got funding for, I will hopefully be able to observe the museums and conduct interviews with both the museum professionals and also hopefully eyewitnesses themselves, which I think is really important for that ethical aspect. So I haven't covered everything that I researched over the last year, and I definitely haven't fully explained everything because, you know, partially due to the time limit and a lot due to the fact that I actually don't know a lot. But I hope that this presentation has been an interesting introduction to my research. I'm looking forward to answering the questions I'm definitely keen to hear any feedback, so thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation, Lauren. Yes, please, to the attendees today and everyone else here in our panel, if you have any questions for any of our panelists, please use the Q&A, or I can see that some of the questions have been added to the chat. It's been really great to hear different ways in which to look at the concept of memory and memorialization, testimony, and the whole way in which these emotions, the history and the way we look at the past shapes the way we think in the present. So I would like to invite people to ask some questions now. Perhaps I can invite Kat and Sam to help me out with the questions here. Thank you. So there is a question from our director of PGR, Liz Renowins. It's for Iona. She says, thanks for a super paper, Iona. I wonder if you could say a bit more about how you will be looking at the ways in which the memory of anti-communist spiritual resistance is contested, thinking specially about the national, transnational element you mentioned earlier. Does the transnational element shape the ways in which it is contested, as well as the ways in which it is commemorated?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really great question, and definitely one that I want to think more about. I've been thinking more and more about contesting this memory because I keep on looking out for it, and at the moment I'm not really seeing it, and I wonder to what extent maybe I'm actually, it's the way that I'm approaching the subject, because I'm looking at particular figures, and actually it could be a case of looking at different figures. I think there's this kind of, there are the sort of two sides to this. One side is the highly politicized version that I presented today, which is this sort of radical right memorialization. But then there's this other one, which is much more mainstream within the Orthodox Church, which is essentially apolitical, and it depoliticizes everything. So the sort of the legionary connections of these figures past is completely whitewashed, and even communism is in a sense whitewashed. And they just become these holy figures. And I think those are kind of the two extremes. And the contestation for me would be somewhere in between. And for the transnational, sort of trying to understand how the transnational element could fit into that type of contestation. I think there is a problem in that a lot of the transnational taking up of this memory, they just don't really understand Romanian history. And they often sort of quote these figures through the Romanian Orthodox Church. So they're coming to this memory in a whitewashed way. And so they're just not really aware of it. So that raises its own dynamics. But yeah, I really want to see this. And I feel that maybe at some point, maybe part of what I will do in my PhD is maybe to just myself challenge some of this, and actually go back to some of the things that these prisoners wrote, and see if maybe there's just contestation in what they did originally. But this is something I'm really interested in exploring.
There's a question here from Sam to Iona as well, and he asks if you could say a bit more about the relationship between anti-communist activists and the church itself, and is there any sense of tension between Christian political activists and the formal clergy?
Yeah, in Romania there's a major tension because the church basically collaborated with the communist regime, and so the church sort of celebrating the anti-communist figures really makes them look rather hypocritical. and they sort of don't want that to be drawn out. So having said that, they are now officially considering at least one prisoner for formal canonization. So it is gradually seeping in. I think the Orthodox Church is quite divided. There are lots of different sort of perspectives within the church. So I would say officially they don't kind of encourage it, but unofficially there is quite a lot of sort of tacit encouragement of this, because it is helping to improve the church's reputation, actually. But I'm interested in going beyond the Orthodox Church. And beyond the Orthodox Church, there's much less tension. There's much more of a crossover. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that was really useful. I just actually was going to ask the canonization of the one particular prisoner. What was the reason behind their decision to do so? Is there anything that was particularly special about this individual, or?
I think mostly, the sort of official grounds are the miracles around him. So he was imprisoned several times, and then he became a monk, and he also became a painter, and he had a really, really odd church painting style, he was a kind of visionary, and he might have had some sort of mental health conditions, and it's quite unclear. But then they say his paintings sort of predicted the invention of the mobile phone and dishes and things. And these are amazing pictures in which he really sort of shows like contrasts Western materialism with sort of pure Orthodox spirituality. So it's mostly, again, he's just acquired this sort of spiritual authority and miracles and that sort. So the tension, the reason he wasn't immediately canonized, well, it takes a long time, but because he had connections to the Legion, but they were pretty circumstantial, and most people agree that he wasn't really an active member.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, really bizarre, quite interesting as well.
Okay, so we have another question in the Q&A, and it's for Lauren from Andrew Mooney. Are the museums that you are looking at in Japan maintained or perhaps regulated by a government institution, or does each museum have full control over its own exhibitions?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. Because I haven't narrowed down this, I've got a massive Excel spreadsheet full of museums. I've not looked into where or the control that each one has, but of the ones I have looked at, a lot of them are run by sort of the city where they're located. That's true of Hiroshima, but then Nagasaki is run by I think it's some sort of private or charity organization. But this is definitely something that I'm looking at, because I think, especially looking at the ethics, it's important to see how much of a role the eyewitnesses themselves have in, like, what say do they have over how their videos and their testimony is used. So I think that's a really important point. So thank you.
Okay, also in the Q&A, there's a comment from David Clark with a question for Lauren. Fascinating presentation, Lauren. Could you say something more about the context in which these testimonies are displayed, viewed? Does this tend to be on online platforms, on monitors in museums, etc.? How do you think you will address those contexts?
Thank you for the question. Yes, this is something I came across in my undergraduate dissertation with Hiroshima. I found that the testimonies were sort of kept in an archive in the library to be watched on demand, or in the museum, but you can watch them in individual booths rather than them forming part of the overall exhibit. So that is interesting. And then since then, when I've been looking again, doing my PhD researching on Hiroshima, I think maybe due to the pandemic, they've started uploading videos to their YouTube channel, because I think they've maybe realised that that's a way that they can reach more people and a way that they can sort of promote the stories without, when people haven't been able to come and visit the museum in person. And it's something that I definitely need to be considering, because I haven't looked in a lot of detail at other methods of displaying them, so not just the video but also text and virtual reality and things like that. So yes, lots of work to be done.
Thank you, Lauren. Also a question from David Clark for Jack. Would you say you are focusing on nostalgia for a specific imagined past? The moving photographs you mentioned seem to be uncoupled from a shared frame. From a shared frame of historical reference. What do you make of the vagueness of this nostalgia? Just a generalized sense of the good old days?
I think largely so, yes. I think with the project, with the because I have discussed this quite a lot about what specific examples of imagined past, because the project is still very much rooted in theory at the moment, and so I have been looking at there's the example of and I will come back to the moving photograph story, but there is the interesting example of the Welsh term hiraeth, which means a kind of longing for a home that was never necessarily always there. And in a sense, it's precisely the vagueness that is important in the in order for the nostalgic fantasy to function, because with this sort of dispersal of that term, I've noticed in this kind of uprootedness of its definition, it's come to mean it's come to mean so many different things in its political appropriation. So there was a US radical right kind of electronic music outfit that called itself hiraeth, even though it had nothing to do with the Welsh, specific Welsh context. So I am interested in starting from the theoretical and going on to the concrete. I think with the moving photographs, I think it was just I think an interesting way of looking at nostalgia in the way that it has mutated and developed today into this kind of interconnected, multiple spectacle that doesn't exactly have that historical reference to anchor it. I think that's really important. That's a really important aspect of my research, particularly in the third chapter. But I also used that as an example because I was aware that the introduction was quite theoretical, so I did need this specific example to anchor it, which I feel does that quite well in its sort of mix of technological acceleration, but at the same time it's blurring of the distinction between preservation and acceleration, which is an important aspect for me. I hope that helps.
There's a question in the chat from Liz Wren Owens for Lauren, and she says that was a really interesting point about how global approaches mean Western approaches, and asks, will you have any points of comparison for Japanese museums in the East or West?
Thanks. I'm not sure what that means, if I'm totally honest. Clarify for me, please.
Liz, would you like to take the floor and perhaps clarify a little bit more?
Yes, sorry, I was just writing it in the chat. I just mean, are you going to look at any other museums as a kind of a point of reference? So you're talking about developing a new theory. Would you then maybe think about, if you developed a new theory, to then maybe apply that to a museum exhibition, either that in the non-Western world, or somewhere like London or Paris, or a different if somewhere in the West? Would you try and apply that new approach to one of those exhibitions, or just maybe set that up as a future project, something you might want to do?
I see. Yeah, that's not something that I've thought about yet, so it was a really interesting point. So I think that's something to look at in the future.
Okay, so we have another question, this time for Jack, from Christopher Hood. Jack, sorry if you covered this in the talk and I missed it, but what geographical areas will you be looking at? In Japan, for example, the concept of nostalgia has always been very positive. There are also some interesting developments there in relation to death and memorialization. I can put you in touch with some people working on this.
Oh, that means an awful lot. Thank you very much, and I'd be really happy to have a look at that, because that is one not so much shortcoming, but just sort of geographical concrete examples. Because yes, at the moment I am mired in theory and maybe even an ideology of universal lack. So it would be definitely important to look at these historical examples. I have read a little bit about Japan in certain contexts, but I think this would be very helpful in contextualizing it. That would be really, thank you very much for that.
A question from Kat to Lauren. She says, great presentation, more of a logistic questions. I am just wondering how you will factor the pandemic into your fieldwork plans and whether you have a plan B. Thanks.
Yeah, that's definitely something that's been sort of on my mind for a while. I think some things can be moved over to sort of digital interviewing, if I can get in contact with the museum professionals via email, and especially the eyewitnesses. A lot of that's moving online thanks to the pandemic. And I think it also, the looking at digital technology also sort of lends itself to this, so that I can, instead of looking at the museums themselves, look at their online presence. It's difficult because this is something that, because of the pandemic, is constantly changing, and museums are definitely sort of changing how they're displaying things. So it's something I've got to keep an eye on and sort of adapt my methodology as I go, I think.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Well, there aren't any more questions in the chat that I can see. If anybody else has a question, please do either ask to speak or type it now. I would like to ask a question to Iona about the relationship between anti-communist and communist memory in Romania. Considering I don't have much experience of Romania, but I'm thinking that it is a place where the whole regime, the Ceausescu regime, has attracted a lot of curiosity, and people visit to see those monuments of communism. So I was wondering, how does this interact in the Romanian context with the memorialization of communist versus anti-communist?
Are you talking about kind of communist nostalgia?
Yes, I was wondering if there is, how does that conflict play out? Because obviously there's that you mentioned that there is this political party that promotes the anti-communist spirituality aspect of memory, and I was wondering if there are any other examples there where these two sides of history collide.
Yeah. I mean, amongst the sort of the anti-communist. I mean, the anti-communist, I don't want to call it a movement, sort of politics. There is they always claim that there's this massive, great nostalgia for communism, and I think that probably is slightly overplayed. There is some. So after 1989, basically the former communists did kind of, essentially, they were the ones who retained a lot of the power. So I don't really know enough about memory of communists. I mean, specifically, I guess in terms of general memorialization of the communist period in Romania, the major thing at first was memorialization of the 1989 revolution. That was just the one thing that was memorialized. They were called martyrs as well, martyr towns. I think in the end, every town might even have been named a martyr town. And then there's been this focus on the period of political imprisonment in the 50s and early 60s. One thing I'm really interested in is to see whether there's whether the memory of anti-communism, particularly through the paradigm of martyrdom, is influenced by sort of communist cultures of martyrdom, if that makes sense. I don't think I've answered your question though. I think I just don't.
No, it's a very specific sort of. I just was wondering, sorry, if there was anything that came to mind, thinking that when there is two sides, ideological sides in a country, usually there's colliding movements to preserve memory. So
I mean, I suppose in this case there is no pro-communist party in Romania. Like, there's no one. There's a bit of communist nostalgia, but there's, as far as I'm aware, like in the public space at least, there's just no.
It doesn't look like there's a movement.
It's kind of, at the moment, it's sort of the liberal anti-communist or the anti-liberal anti-communist. That's sort of one of the main dynamics.
Thank you. All right, so perhaps I can ask a question to Jack about the idea of nostalgia, because you mentioned that there is this nostalgic drive that pushes us to, I think you said something along the lines of find some way of becoming whole, or yes. And I was wondering if it's always linked to a past experience, or is nostalgia more to do with the idealization of either a past or a future?
I think that those, so in the former that you mentioned, that with a specific attachment to a past moment, I think that that even that can depend on some kind of phantasmatic backdrop in order for it to make sense as this meaningful, sort of painful attachment, and sort of related to that as a kind of concrete example, because and sort of connecting various things here, and hopefully to give a more satisfying answer to what David asks about a shared historical reference earlier, because I want to give this example of sort of contemporary kind of international far right, alt right politics online, and this idea that because if you look at a lot of their propaganda, which can it even be reliably called that anymore? It's a lot of it isn't really following this logic of patrimonious devotion to certain people. It's this sort of simulated, recycled mishmash of different times and spaces coming together at the same time. There's this you know, there's, for instance, as I referred to earlier, there was a music video that one particular sort of dissident American right came out with, and it was like a video for a bank. It was like an ad for a bank. There was all this kind of lost, kind of empty signifiers, and I think there might be a connection there with Christopher's point about Japan, because they're I don't. It's not a precise equivalent to Western alt-right, but the Neto Uyoku, which are their version of a kind of online inhabiting far-right movement. And that's sort of related to why I want to bring accelerationism into this, because for me, I see it as a theory of runaway time, that we can't really, that this process is just going ahead of us and denying conceptual regrouping to work out where we are. And I think that nostalgia is always a follow-up to a specifically modern condition. And I think, and moving away from that and coming back to your original question about that attachment to childhood, maybe, that is a specifically modern concern. So you didn't have this kind of, it was nostalgia for childhood only really became privatized and internalized in the way that we experience it today in the sort of 19th and 20th centuries. It's something that follows a logic of modern development. So these, and that's why I try to look at it. I like to take advantage of books like Ryan Lizardi's Mediated Nostalgia, where he looks at nostalgia as a kind of product of new media technologies that have realized that they can derive a lot of profit from just rehashing old shows over and over again, because they know that this will create a positive feedback loop. But I sort of want to look at it beyond that to see where the nostalgia is going in terms of a nostalgia after the human. And I want to look at that in the same way as, and so I'm interested, obviously maybe not so much in this project, but just as an example of the shared historical reference, I see in right-wing politics increasingly just a kind of manic nihilism rather than any kind of conservative adulation of a certain time and a certain space. But yes, yeah, in various ways, I think I might have answered your question. Yeah.
Thank you, Jack. Well, we've reached the end of our Q&A session. Please join us for a coffee break on a Zoom call. I'm going to share the link on the chat. And also, if you haven't done so, please visit our virtual gallery on Art Steps. And we have the program as well. There's a link for the program in the chat if you haven't had a chance to look at the whole plan for the day. Thank you very much to all our panelists today. It was very interesting to listen to your projects, and I look forward to hearing more about them in the next years, because obviously this is your first year, so there's a lot more to come. It was fantastic to have you here today, and I will see you again for the rest of the panels today.